He's mostly awake and ready to rumble. It's the Michael Duke Show every weekday morning on AM 700 KBYR and Oldies 102.1.
Michael Duke Show, your home for Common Sense Radio. Tom Harris is the Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. He's taught a bunch of students about climate change from an earth sciences perspective. He speaks about a bunch of different stuff. Today, he's joining us to talk specifically about how America can dominate the world energy market. Tom Harris, we welcome him back to the program. Good morning, Tom.
Yeah, hi, Michael. How are you?
Good, sir. Good. So, I mean, we're feeling pretty good in a lot of ways. The Senate just passed the latest tax bill, which has within it some ANWR provisions. So we're going to see some energy, some resource development and drilling here in the state of Alaska. We're feeling pretty good about that. But are there other ways that America can dominate the world energy market outside of development of fossil fuels?
Yes. Well, actually, fossil fuels is the key. Because you can't really dominate in nuclear, for example, because you don't have much nuclear. You only have about 4% of the world's natural gas. Okay, so you can dominate, well, certainly you can supply your own supply. And if you could expand your liquefied natural gas facilities an enormous amount, about 20-fold, you could, in the short term, dominate natural gas. But in the long term, it's going to be pretty tough because beyond the 4% of world reserves, we don't really know how much natural gas the United States has. So that's a very iffy kind of route to go through natural gas to dominate the world. Two other routes, though, are very promising. One of them is oil. The United States could be a net exporter of oil within 5 years because it turns out that there's something called the Permian Basin that spans West Texas and southeastern New Mexico. And the estimate is that it could contain as many as 135 billion barrels of oil. Okay, more oil. And that would put it as big as the largest oil fields in Saudi Arabia. And if that's the case, the U.S., you really could dominate world market in oil. The other area is in coal. You know, people forget the United States is the Saudi Arabia of coal. I mean, you have more coal than anybody on the planet. And in fact, you have a 381-year supply at current usage rates. But, you know, like natural gas and like oil, the expansion of coal has been crippled by the climate scare. And I'll just give you some interesting statistics. The United States has a lot of unused capacity in their mines. In fact, the unused capacity is so big, it's equivalent to the total amount that Australia exports, because Australia is the leading exporter of coal. And yet you have that much coal that's unused capacity, okay? Now the reason it's part of the reason it's not being used is because you don't have export facilities, because the big markets in Asia, China especially, will gobble up your coal because your coal is priced very well. And if you can get it to them, you got a great opportunity to dominate world coal markets. But right now the U.S. exports no more coal than Poland, because you can't get your export facilities built, and a large reason for that is because of the climate scare. And, you know, within the United States, you should be going back to a lot more coal because there is new kinds of coal burning facilities that are available that Germany uses. You know, a lot of Europe and China and India, they use these facilities to burn coal much more cleanly. But you can't do it because there are current regulations in the United States that are preventing the expansion of these things by putting on unreasonable limits on carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, well, of course, carbon dioxide is not pollution. So, you know, this climate scare could completely nix the opportunity for the United States not only to expand its coal supply and, or I should say, its coal usage domestically, but it could also nix this really great opportunity you have to dominate the world in oil and coal.
Well, and we've seen that here in Alaska because Alaska has a large coal export, issue and facility. We were exporting, metric tons of this stuff to Korea. And then we had environmentalists come in and say, well, your system of loading the barges and the ships, which was taking place down in Whittier, is problematic because it allows chunks of coal to fall into the ocean, and that's pollution, and you need to stop that.
Well, of course, they can clean it up.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think, yeah, okay, so I mean, I'm down with that, but yeah, I mean, it's put the whole industry here in the state of Alaska. We have a pretty good sized coal industry here in the state of Alaska. It's put that whole thing in jeopardy now, and to add to that, like you said, the whole issue of climate change, and to put that specter on top of it, it really has crippled America as an energy producer, because there's lots of other countries out there that are ambivalent to that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't burn it or mine it or extract it, responsibly, but there are countries out there that just don't give two craps about any of that stuff, and they're just going Katie bar the door. We need to be able to find out a way to do all this stuff cleanly, economically, and responsibly. And I think we're moving in that direction.
Yeah. Well, actually, we've got to get rid of some of these stupid regulations that are preventing the U.S. from really, developing the super clean stations that are possible. We had an article published today. I'll send it to you. It was in Colorado, and there's a little note here from my co-author. He said, "I'm a power engineer with more than 60 years in business all over the world. A modern, very efficient, supercritical coal-fired station, the sort of station that is being built almost everywhere except the United States, is as clean as can be. Its emissions consist of water vapor and carbon dioxide and, of course, nitrogen. The stack gas cleanup removes virtually all the sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide, which are the real pollutants. Okay, the only thing it discharges is ash, and that's relatively easy to control." And then he goes on to say, the United States is not building modern supercritical stations because the EPA set the allowable emissions of carbon dioxide generated below the best that can be achieved with the best technology. Okay? But if it were slightly higher, the U.S. could be leading the world in building modern, clean, and efficient coal stations, which is happening in Europe, China, and India. And, of course, Michael, that goes right back to the climate scare, because that was one of the regulations that Obama brought in to basically kill the coal industry. And boy, did he succeed. Before he came into power, 52% of America's electricity came from coal. And it was much higher, of course, in some states. Now it's down around 30%. Okay, so that's one of the main focuses the U.S. should look at if they really want to dominate world coal markets, but also to greatly reduce their own electricity costs.
Well, and again, I think that, your point is well made. I think that we should also, but I think we need to be looking at everything. And quite honestly, I'm wondering, why are we not bringing these coal plants on? Why are we not talking more about, clean nuclear energy, things that are going on? I know that in France, for example, they're generating a substantial amount of their power grid from nuclear plants there and doing quite well with it. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 or 80%. I mean, it's a significant a way to do it, but it just seems like we get so baked in a squat and so afraid of, the different aspects of what's going on, whether it was Chernobyl or whatever, in the nuclear side, or like you said, the CO2 emissions on the coal side. We're almost intentionally kneecapping ourselves on this deal.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, if it were true that man-made carbon dioxide cause dangerous global warming, the best option would be nuclear. Okay, but the environmental extremists, they claim that nuclear power is too dangerous, even though the only recorded deaths from nuclear power generation occurred at Chernobyl. And that was a terrible old station. It was poorly operated, and basically that won't happen here. Okay, the next best option would be natural gas. But despite the excellent safety record of fracking, activists oppose that also. So they're saying wind and solar power, but wind and solar power, to be a significant contributor, they rely on heavy subsidies. And in the hearing that happened last week, the EPA had a hearing, Environmental Protection Agency had a hearing in West Virginia on the Clean Power Plan. And Bob Murray, who's with Murray Energy, he actually gave some of the numbers, okay, for what it costs to compare coal, for example, to renewable. He says that coal, and I'm reading from his testimony here, coal generation typically costs 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Renewable source generation costs 26 cents per kilowatt hour, and it receives subsidies of 4 cents per kilowatt hour from the taxpayer. So, I mean, yeah, sure, you could switch to that. It would have bankrupt your country. And in fact, what would happen is very much like what happened here in Ontario. In Ontario in 2002, we had a quarter of our electricity from coal, and our government decided we were going to lead the world on climate change, even though we were only half of 1% of world emissions. So they got rid of the coal stations, and they brought in billions of dollars worth of wind turbines. And now the electricity rates, believe it or not, at the peak time of day when most people use it, are 318% higher than 2002. And the main reason for that was the getting rid of our least expensive source, which of course was coal. I'm not talking about 30% rise, 318% rise. So, I mean, that's where the U.S. would go if you followed the environmentalists.
Yeah. Well, and again, this is spooky stuff. We're talking, by the way, with Tom Harris, who is the executive director of the International Climate Science Coalition, here on the Michael Duke Show, AM 700 KBYR, Oldies 102.1. So, Tom, where do we go from here? I mean, you're right. I think that we need to be looking at this. We need to be pushing for these new, super high efficiency coal plants. We need to be, looking for more ways to think. You're talking about that new field in Texas. Between that field and the Bakken formation, I mean, we'll have, 3 or 4 times the oil of Saudi Arabia. I mean, why aren't we out there making these things happen?
Well, it's because most people, even people in the energy industry, are so afraid of political incorrectness that they won't say what's true. I mean, you see, even people in the coal industry will sometimes call it carbon pollution. No, it's carbon dioxide, okay? And I went to the conference in Houston, the America First Energy Conference on November 9th. They had a presentation there from a fellow who's a specialist in carbon dioxide. And you have to remember, the only gas controlled by the Clean Power Plan is carbon dioxide, which of course is plant food. And here's a direct quote from Craig Idso from the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. This is what he told the audience. He said, the whole terrestrial biosphere is reaping incredible benefits from the 40% increase in CO2 since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so he's saying we need more CO2 because we need to increase the densification of our crops. In fact, it's interesting, crop yield has really gone up, and he showed all the statistics, how many more people we can feed because of increased CO2 emissions. So, the whole idea that we have to limit America's energy growth because of CO2, I mean, come on, that doesn't make any sense at all. Hello.
I'm sorry, Tom. Does this become more an issue of doctrine versus science? I mean, dogma and belief versus actual hard facts?
Yeah, and it's also right out of 1984, okay? This is Newspeak. You remember in 1984, they had Newspeak, which was supposed to basically correct the thinking patterns of the population. And they do that all the time. By calling carbon dioxide, which is benign, which is plant food, by calling it carbon pollution, which Obama and many people on the left of the spectrum actually do, they're using Newspeak because carbon sounds black and dirty, I mean, it sounds like soot, which is, of course, carbon. But carbon dioxide is invisible. It's plant food. It's benign. And they do it all the time. They say climate change is real. Well, of course it's real. I mean, we've had climate change forever. I mean, otherwise we'd be still in an ice age. So a lot of the language, people have to be careful not to use the language of the extremists. Otherwise, it's like Newspeak right out of 1984.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what worries me is that when you have people that go into something with preconceived notions, with dispositions, with, kind of outcome-based science. We saw that with the IPCC. We saw that these were people who had an outcome that they wanted, and so they went to make the numbers match the outcome that they were looking for. I mean, when we see that overall, we just realize that's not good science. That's not what you want. And I know folks like you and folks with the ICSC, you guys are chastised sometimes for being scientists who are against, how could you be against climate change? But like you said, climate change is real, but shouldn't we base it on evidence and science, not on presupposition and philosophy instead?
That's right. Well, the whole climate scare is not based on what's happened over the past century because there's only been 0.8 degrees Celsius warming. I mean, that's very little and it's been beneficial. The climate scare is based on the forecast of the future by computer models. And at the America First Energy Conference in Houston, University of Delaware climatology professor Dr. David Legates, he showed us how the computer models forecast and what the world actually did. And he explained that the models are tuned to give the results desired for political purposes. And he put a big slide on the screen and he said, this is not science. Okay? Because, I mean, if it were science, when the models don't meet reality, then we would say, well, then the models aren't very good, are they? But instead, they use the models instead to forecast future climate policy and to spend billions of dollars ignoring the fact the models don't work.
Right. Well, and maybe that's just that. Maybe that's the story that we need to put on repeat. That, the models are not working. They're not based on actual science. They're based on presuppositions, and they're making it match. And we need to start putting, America first in that regard and creating energy sources, because that's what creates a prosperous nation. Affordable energy is one of the cornerstones to creating a prosperous nation, both in industry and in technology and everything else. We need that. And right. Without it, we'll fall off the map, and we won't be the world leader anymore, because, like you said, if everybody's paying 318% more just to heat their home and keep their lights on, it makes it a lot tougher for things to go on.